Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this book talk today. I'm CNN's national security correspondent, Natasha Bertrand, and I'm so happy to be joined by Lucian Kim to talk about his great new book, Putin's Revenge: Why Russia Invaded Ukraine. It's extremely timely, of course, given everything that's going on, not only today, but of course, over the last several months with the new administration and the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine that have faltered a bit, but that are ongoing nonetheless. And so I want to introduce Lucian. He is currently a senior analyst for Ukraine at the International Crisis Group. He tracks and analyzes developments in the war in Ukraine. And before joining the crisis group, Lucian worked as a journalist for many, many years covering Eastern and Central Europe. Most recently, he was NPR's Moscow based correspondent, and he has been traveling to Ukraine for about 2 decades now regularly. He also, in 2014, covered Russia's occupation of Crimea, and he is now the author of this new book that traces the origins of Ukraine's war that was published last year. So, Lucian, I'm going to turn it over to you to make any opening remarks you may have.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks, Natasha, for agreeing to do this. And first and foremost, my thanks goes to the Atlantic Council for hosting this event. It was actually supposed to be an in-person event, but due to circumstances beyond my control, we had to postpone it to today. But I'm certainly happy that so many people could join online, and I'm ready to answer all of your questions, Natasha, and then I think we'll open it up and take audience questions as well. Obviously, I think I do hope that this book is timely because every time we hear remarks about the negotiation process from the out of the Kremlin, we always hear talk about the root causes of the war. And that was actually the goal of this book, was to investigate exactly why Putin took this decision to launch a full-scale invasion after launching a partial invasion in 2014, seizing land from Ukraine and starting an insurgency. Why did he make this decision then to actually do an all-out war against Ukraine? So I think we should just jump in. I'm
Yeah.
curious as to what your questions are, and then as to what the audience has to say as well. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that a natural place to start is with the book's title. You've placed a huge desire or a huge emphasis in this book on Putin's desire for retribution, and you spent years reporting, obviously, from Russia, so you have a really good understanding of Russian culture and zeitgeist. Can you just start a bit by talking about the relationship between Vladimir Putin and today's Russia, and whether you think at its root this is Putin's war or is it Russia's war? Because millions of Russians, they did at the outset at least support this war, and in the beginning they rushed to help fight it.
Yes, I can understand why some people might ask, well, Putin's war, this was probably something much larger. We do know, as you say, that Russians did and continue to support this war. My main argument here is that yes, there is a deep feeling of nostalgia for the Soviet Union and for empire as such in Russia. This idea of that Russia, in whatever form it takes, as the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire before it, that Russia has a historic mission to be the core of a great Eurasian land empire. And that is certainly a feeling that is shared by people across Russia and also across generations. Uh, my argument here is that, why do I say Putin's revenge? Putin is the one in a very, very small circle of advisors who took the decision, well, first of all, to annex Crimea, to seize and illegally annex Crimea, and then later to launch the full-scale invasion. This was not a decision that he took with out of a sort of democratic democratically mandated desire by the Russian people. This was something that he took very much on his own. And in fact, my key arguments, not to give away too much of the book, but the key arguments, which I lay out also in the introduction, are that on one hand, the subtitle of the book is Why Russia Invaded Ukraine. I mean, the first reason, primary driving reason is obviously this idea of Russian imperialism. But the second key ingredient is Putin's authoritarianism. And the fact that as his system became more and more authoritarian, as the longer he stayed in power, he became more paranoid. He began to feel that, the West was closing in around him, and he was also very conscious of his historical legacy. So, it was essentially a decision by one man to launch this invasion. I do not believe that that is something that a democratic Russia would have done, and that's also part of my argument.
So unpack that a little bit because you mentioned just then that Putin felt that the West was kind of closing in around him. And obviously, NATO membership for Ukraine has been one of the key sticking points for Vladimir Putin, or at least that's what he says publicly. But I'm wondering what you found actually led to Putin's evolution on Ukraine, because when he started his term in office in 2000, he was broadly viewed as a pragmatic leader inside Ukraine, according to what you write, and he was actually popular there. So I'm fascinated by your suggestions throughout the book that the West actually played a not insignificant role in instigating his devolution on this.
Absolutely. The West did play a role in this. Constantly, it was always sort of the antagonist to Putin's goals as he evolved as a leader. And when he came into office 25 years ago, he did not even rule out Russia one day joining NATO. And although it might have seemed even far-fetched back then, it was something that was on the agenda. His idea was to lift Russia onto a level of an EU country. I mean, he was talking about GDP, per capita GDP equivalent to Portugal. That was when he came into power. It was very much a Western-oriented policy, and I think people in the West were rather seduced by him because here was a leader who was in great contrast to his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin. He was sober. That was very important. And he seemed to be a modern, very business-oriented guy, right? He was always ready to do business with the West. And I think that's why he was often forgiven some of the other things that he did very early in his rule, the second invasion of campaign against Crimea, and then continuing campaign against independent media and independent voices within Russia. So I tried to lay out in my book, there is a popular idea in the West. It's also propagated, obviously, by the Kremlin that NATO is to blame and that the enlargement of NATO is the reason. And as someone who covered the enlargement of NATO and was inside Russia as Russia was enlarging, I wanted to really take that apart, deconstruct it, and see how much of it, how much of a role did NATO actually play. One thing is, of course, you cannot argue with is that the Russians were very annoyed by a NATO expansion. I am certainly not implying that in any way. But as soon as you begin to look at the historical record, it becomes much more cloudy about whether whether NATO really played such a decisive role. And I think here again we have Putin's own paranoia that is much more important. I can go into a little bit more detail if you want. I mean, the key date that we think of is 2008. That is when George W. Bush really pushed to let Ukraine and Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, into NATO, at least to give them a so-called membership action plan. And that was opposed by many NATO members, including Germany and France. And it was also a very controversial idea within Ukraine itself. There was no majority in Ukraine that actually thought this was a great idea. So George Bush was sort of unilaterally pushing this idea because he wanted to reward Ukraine for its participation in the occupation of Iraq. And my argument is, so, well, they went on to the NATO summit. Putin even made an appearance there. It was so important to him. And the NATO leaders reached this compromise where they opened the door to Ukraine. They said one day Ukraine and Georgia will join without ever giving any specifics. So it was this compromise that put Ukraine in a very dangerous position. NATO had no intention of letting in Ukraine. But from the Russian perspective, obviously this door was already open. So Ukraine found itself really in the worst of two worlds, because it was not going to enter NATO, but Russia was led to believe that this would eventually happen. And so I actually lay quite a lot of responsibility at George Bush's doorstep for doing this, because as the tragedy of for Ukraine is that after George W. Bush left office, no U.S. president was interested in Ukraine joining NATO, but even more generally interested in Ukraine as a country. It was sort of, there was a acquiescence to the idea that Russia had a sphere of influence there. And so we had Barack Obama did not care about Ukraine or bringing it into NATO. Donald Trump after him, and Joe Biden at the beginning of his administration was also very disdainful of Ukraine, of Volodymyr Zelensky, and Joe Biden put a priority on meeting Vladimir Putin at a summit in June of 2021. And the reason for that, of course, is that from the U.S. perspective, this is, Russia is a pure nuclear power, and sort of keeping a floor under relations has a much higher priority than getting involved with Ukraine. So that's the tragedy, is that the United States, in fact, did not care about Ukraine, but Putin, in his paranoia, decided that it was exactly the opposite case.
It's so ironic. And I think that this is such an important point that people don't necessarily realize who aren't reporting on this day to day, is that while the US and the West have repeatedly dangled NATO membership in front of Ukraine's face for years and years, they've never actually seriously wanted Ukraine as a member of NATO. But still, as you say, the optics of it and the fact that they are telling Ukraine, one day you're going to be a member of NATO. Just wait a little longer. Just make a few more reforms. That in turn, of course, fueled the paranoia of Vladimir Putin and his inner circle there. So it's just the kind of catch-22 that they put Ukraine in. I think is so. Is so relevant to what we're dealing with right now. And
And I
so I
would add,
wonder, yeah.
Natasha, there, that it's also the European Union, right? The European
Mhm.
Union also was in discussions with Ukraine. Um, was negotiating an association agreement, and even today, we see this now after the full-scale invasion. Accession talks have begun in earnest, but my realistic assessment of the situation is that Ukraine is very, very far from EU accession, and we're going to see a lot of disappointment in Ukraine with the West, almost no matter what happens. I mean, NATO is off the table definitely in the near future. The EU membership is a very long-term project, and it's really a tragedy, because Ukrainians are the only Europeans during the Maidan protests in 2014 who died holding European flags in their hands. I would just add that.
Totally. And I wonder if you can explain a little bit as well why the West is making these empty promises repeatedly to Ukraine. Why it is a fact, as of now anyway, that Ukraine is not going to join NATO anytime soon. Why are they so reluctant to allow Ukraine to join this alliance? Is it because of Russia and its power, and because it's just so risky, and the US and the West are kind of afraid of the reaction that it would provoke from Putin?
Well, let's be clear about who wants to let Ukraine into NATO. Joe Biden, was also against letting Ukraine into NATO. And during the first NATO summit of his term in 2021, right before he met Vladimir Putin, the Ukrainians weren't invited. The Ukrainians were invited to the summit, and the Ukrainians were furious. Now we're hearing there are reports that maybe Volodymyr Zelensky this time will not be invited to the NATO summit in June in the Netherlands. So there is this there's a continuity in the American position. Really, George W. Bush was an outlier here.
Mm.
Uh, the standard thinking is why would we let Ukraine into NATO when it is such a when its membership in Ukraine is in NATO is such a red flag for Russia, pure nuclear power. It's really, as I mentioned before, despite all its rhetoric about the independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity of Ukraine, in many ways, the U.S. has really accepted a sphere of influence, a Russian sphere of influence in Ukraine, and of course, it has to do with Russia's nuclear arsenal and the fact that the United States. And I think we have to focus on the United States primarily, but also other European countries. They don't see vital national interests in Ukraine. And I think this has always been Ukraine's problem in selling itself to the rest of the world. That yes, we've been part of the Russian Empire for 300 years, but but we are still a separate people. I mean, they're having this trouble to step out of the shadow of this of Russian history, and it's a great challenge for Ukraine.
And I also just want to take this moment to remind people that you can ask Lucian questions directly at askac.org. And I'll be reading some of those out to Lucian in 10 or 15 minutes. So I want to go back to the origins of this phase of the war, since obviously the war's been going on since 2014, but going back to 2022, what do you think are some of the key issues that led Putin to decide not to continue with the more covert operations, say in Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, and actually ultimately decide on this full-scale invasion?
Well, there are really a number of factors. Um, I think one factor was absolutely the COVID pandemic and the fact that Vladimir Putin found himself very isolated and with a very small group of advisors who took a hard line against the United States, against the West, and against Ukraine. So he was already sort of in a bubble, and a bubble of very toxic interpretation of Russian history and Russia's historical mission as an empire and Ukraine's key role in that empire. So he had already surrounded himself. His milieu was already very, very one-sided. He did not hear a lot of opinions during COVID. There were some other factors. I mean, I do not think it's trivial that in the year 2022, when this full-scale invasion took place, Vladimir Putin was going to turn 70 years old in October. And we know that he pays great attention to dates. So I think top of his mind was also his historical legacy. How will I be remembered? Will I be remembered as the Russian leader who, in quotes, lost Ukraine, or will I be remembered as the one who reconquered Ukraine? I think this was also top of mind. There was a great deal of hubris, as with all military military adventures of this nature. Of course, there was the brutal Chechen campaigns, but then there was the short Georgia War, which I also discuss in my book. There was the Syrian campaign, which from the Russian point of view was extremely successful. Of course, it was very limited. It was an air campaign. And then we, shortly before the full-scale invasion, Russia also had a very limited intervention in Kazakhstan, where it propped up a friendly government. So I think there was a sense of like, our army, which we've been pouring so much money into, which we've reformed and modernized, is now ready to take on this task. Vladimir Putin was also getting very bad intelligence. And I think this is also, he became a victim of his own system. Sure, he's the top dog in the Russian system, but everyone, it's filled with yes men and people who are trying to satisfy him. And we know now that in many ways the planning for this operation was not really a military plan. Well, there was military planning behind it, but um, the main planners were in the FSB, in the security service, Russian security service, and that they were using um, cooked intelligence, which they gave to Putin. And I mean, Putin was under the impression that that Russian troops would be met with flowers and chocolates and cheering Ukrainians. So I think the fact that he had a really skewed understanding of where Ukraine was, and I find this mind-boggling because as someone who's just traveled to Ukraine and talked to people, all sorts of people, including people who sympathize with Russia, you would never have gotten the impression that this was going to be something that would be wildly popular. I think there was also one other key factor which I mentioned, and this has to do with the situation domestically in Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky was actually not doing so well in the polls, and I think Putin decided that Zelensky could be easily toppled, that he was kind of a straw man and didn't have a lot of popular support. And he had a main proxy inside Ukraine named Viktor Medvedchuk, who is a Ukrainian oligarch who's also linked to the Putin family. And Zelensky put Medvedchuk under house arrest, basically froze his pro-Russian media assets and put him under house arrest. And I think this was also a decisive moment in the Russian. That was just from the Russian point of view, or from the Putin's point of view personally. This was sort of they saw their last instrument of soft power vanish within Ukraine. And so it was a confluence of factors. It was also the fact that Russia had accumulated something like $600 billion in foreign reserves, gold reserves. So there was this feeling that we have the money. Ukraine is going to lie down before us in a matter of weeks, if not days. Our army is strong. The Ukrainians are going to run away. So it was, combination of all these things. But as always, first and foremost, hubris, incredible hubris, based
Right,
on.
and what was going on inside the mind of one man, really. I want to talk a little bit about Vladimir Zelensky because he is just such an interesting character to say the least, and he was clearly a uniquely irritating figure for Putin. But I also want to, you touched a little bit on how Russia may have sensed weakness in Ukraine with Zelensky not polling great. Do you think he also sensed weakness by the United States, by the West? There's an argument in particular on the right that the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 may have somewhat influenced Putin's perception of how willing or unwilling the US was to get involved in another conflict abroad. What do you think about that argument?
I've heard this argument, of course, often that Afghanistan was, played a huge role in Putin's decision making. Of course, we don't know what was happening inside his mind. I think that's a little bit an American-centric way of looking at things. Obviously, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a catastrophe. But I think, as I point out in my book, even when Putin first went into Ukraine in 2014, he had the confidence because of Russia's nuclear arsenal, and sort of this knowledge that the West is not going to get involved because of our nuclear weapons. So I don't think the fact that I mean, it certainly didn't help the American standing in the world the way that the U.S. Left Afghanistan, but I don't see how that played a crucial role in his thinking. This was Ukraine is very close to uh, it's close. It's maybe not enough. I mean, it is an obsession of Putin's, and he was not going to let go of Ukraine regardless whatever happened. If the Americans had a great withdrawal from Afghanistan, I don't think it would have really affected this. This is in Putin's mind is a core vital interest, and I don't want to get ahead of myself. Maybe you have some questions about the peace process, but that is also why this peace process is so fraught, because this is not a war about territory. This is a war about control of all of Ukraine.
Absolutely, and that's a pretty central thesis of your book as well. So to just briefly, because you touched on Zelensky and how he featured in Vladimir Putin's mind and looms so large. What you talk a lot about his rise. There's a whole section in your book about Zelensky's rise and how he actually really got his big break in Russia with Russian audiences, living in Moscow. What what do you make of Zelensky and how he has navigated this very, very just weird path that he's had from comedian and entertainer whose primary audience was Russian in the beginning of his career to now?
Yeah, well, I smiled earlier also when you said that Zelensky was so irritating to Putin. I mean, he is irritating to Putin because here's a guy who was a comedian coming into power. Putin didn't even want to recognize him as a leader at all. And so yes, and now he's the leader who has defied the Russian army in all its might for more than 3 years. So yes, he is very irritating. Uh, I think Volodymyr Zelensky irritates a lot of people, though. He's definitely irritated Joe Biden a lot. We don't hear about it a lot, but behind the scenes, we know that Joe Biden was extremely frustrated with the way that Zelensky spoke, and of course, we saw how that went with the Trump Zelensky dynamic is also extremely extremely difficult to put it lightly. So I write in my book that I think Zelensky is an interesting character because here is a Ukrainian who grew up or who came of age right at he was a teenager when Ukraine became independent. He comes from a scrappy Eastern industrial town. Um, that's where Russian is spoken, and certainly in his family, he was a Russian speaker, and he made his career. All his movies are in Russian, even the ones that he made for a Ukrainian audience. His most famous series, Servant of the People, is in Russian because he was always looking out for a Russian audience, and he lived several years in Moscow. So I describe him as kind of very illustrative. In some ways, he's typical of many Ukrainians who speak Russian at home, and who maybe were not, did not consider themselves Ukrainian patriots in the beginning, certainly not during the Maidan protests in 2014. Zelensky was totally agnostic about that. And even once Crimea happened, that I mean, it took them. It was a shock for them. The seizure of Crimea was a shock. The start of this insurgency in eastern Ukraine. They had trouble accepting this because they had seen Russia basically as a friendly country, and so to me, Volodymyr Zelensky, simply as a Ukrainian citizen, is illustrative of his evolution, right? Because he came to power when he came into office on a wave of great discontent in Ukraine, partially because the war in the East was simmering. That was obviously not the only complaint. Corruption was another complaint. Um, he came in and he was accused by his opponents of being a Russian tool. Really, he was the nationalist wing in Ukraine said, this guy can't be trusted. He's going to crumple before Putin. He's a Russian speaker, and what we saw was, first of all, and I think it's also instructive now to remember these things. Zelensky's first goal was really to reach out to Donald Trump, who was in his first term. He really wanted to reach out. He wanted a meeting. This was incredibly important for him. He wanted a meeting with Donald Trump to show Putin that the U.S. still has our back, and that I'm going with the backing of the United States. And of course, um, we know that how that went. It ended in a phone call where Donald Trump, full well understanding what Zelensky needed from him, tried to turn it into a quid pro quo where he said, well, you can have this meeting, but first you're going to have to do me a favor, which was opening investigations against Joe Biden and his son in Ukraine. And that was sort of how and leading to Trump's first impeachment. And that was sort of, how that's the impression of Zelensky that Trump left office with. So very, very, very negative.
Yeah, and you talked briefly about Crimea as well, and I think that the question of Crimea is so interesting now. Just fast forwarding to the negotiations that are happening right now. You have two delegations meeting in Istanbul, a Russian delegation and a Ukrainian delegation. Obviously, nothing is going to be worked out today because they're pretty low-level delegations. Vladimir Putin did not attend. I'm curious what you make of that as well. But just rewinding a little bit to the question of Crimea, because the United States has said that as part of a peace process, they would be willing to recognize Crimea as Russian. And in your book, you wrote that in 2014, Crimea's grievances about neglect by Kyiv, those had actually been a significant reason why so many were ready to join Russia. But then that actually all changed by about 2018 when the repressions and the lack of any kind of political freedom started to really rear its head there. So can you talk a little bit about how Crimea looms as in all of these negotiations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been to Crimea 3 times. The first time I went was around 2000. Uh, I don't know, 2007, 2008. I have it in my book. And that was just as a tourist. I went from Russia. It was really easy to get down there from Russia. And I just went as a tourist. Um, what struck me at that time about Crimea was just how poor it was. It was a tourist, it's always been a tourist destination for when it was part of the Soviet Union and even when it was part of independent Ukraine. A lot of Russian tourists went there, a lot of Ukrainians went there. It was a cheap place to go on vacation, but it was crumbling. It was really falling apart. The second time I went was actually at the height of this crisis in 2014, right before the Russian military began seizing Crimea, and then during the seizure, I was also there. And of course, I talked to a lot of people. There was great, as you mentioned, there was great frustration in Crimea. Crimeans had actually supported Viktor Yanukovych, who was a Kremlin-backed president who was ousted by popular protests. They actually had supported him, but at the same initially, but they were extremely frustrated with his government as well because he had basically installed his cronies to run Crimea. So there was this simmering resentment in Crimea against anything that came from Kiev. And I do think their feelings of neglect were justified in that sense. They just didn't feel like they were, getting the attention that they needed. So, when Viktor Yanukovych fled and he ended up in Russia, and a provisional government took over in 2014 after those protests, people in Crimea were very concerned about how they would be treated. And as I point out, the Kremlin really exploited that situation. And I think in my book, I lay out some details that are maybe not so well known about how the Russians actually prepared the annexation. This was not a spontaneous act that suddenly happened because the conditions had become so intolerable in Crimea. In fact, very little changed in Crimea on the ground. I was there. But what had changed was that there was a new pro-Western government in Kiev, and it really seemed like the Kremlin was following a plan to go ahead and take Crimea. So at that time, it happened almost without any bloodshed. It was the Russians were already based in Ukraine. The Russian Black Sea Fleet was already there. And there was a lot of sympathy on the ground for the Russians. And exactly because of this uncertain situation, a lot of people thought Russia would be a better guarantor of prosperity than Kiev. However, I do point out in the book, the last independent poll that was taken in Crimea in literally right before the annexation in February 2014 showed that 41% of Crimeans thought that Crimea should join Russia. So it's still not a majority, right? It was not. It was, and of course Russia then rammed through these a sham referendum, literally at gunpoint, and no one really takes those results, including Crimeans. No one really takes those results very seriously. I think it was 97% on the official results. What we know about Crimea is that yes, it was sort of the uh, it was definitely the lowest hanging fruit from the Russian perspective. There was a lot of sympathy for Russia, but it's a far cry from saying that all Crimeans were ready to join Russia. And from the Ukrainian perspective, Crimea always had that because it had been part of administratively part of Russia until 1954. It was it was also considered a little bit, it even had its own autonomous status. So in some ways, people talk about de facto and de jure. Well, de facto is it's you don't have to do anything for it to be de facto. It just is, right? I mean Russia controls Crimea. No one is disputing that. But this idea of now for the United States to recognize it de jure is, comes as quite a shock, because the United States has in the past also not recognized Soviet annexations. The annexation of the three Baltic countries by the Soviet Union were never recognized by the United States. And of course, de facto, they were part of the Soviet Union, but the United States refused to do that on paper, and it was very symbolic. And I think history showed that the United States had taken a very principled stance. And so from the Ukrainian position right now, although it was never realistic to think that the Ukrainian army could somehow reconquer Crimea militarily, the idea that the biggest partner of Crimea would basically on paper, give Crimea to Russia is unfathomable, and frankly, it's from a Ukraine perspective totally unacceptable. And I would say, I think for most European countries, because it sets a very dangerous precedent. It basically says, if you can seize a piece of of another country's territory successfully, if you can do it, well then, you can keep it, and that sends a very dangerous message to the rest of the world.
And I think there's also a school of thought, at least among some very senior negotiators in the Trump administration, Steve Witkoff being one, or at least as far as he articulated last month, that if you just give Russia Crimea, if you just give them these parts of eastern Ukraine that they say they already hold and therefore should control permanently, then the fighting will stop. But as you said earlier, one of your central points in this book is that this is not a war over certain parts of Ukraine or absorbing some territory. It's a war about control over Ukraine in its entirety. Because going back to the title of your book, Putin's Revenge, I mean, this is fundamental to his way of thinking. And so, I just wonder what that says to you about the feasibility of the negotiations that the Trump administration is pushing, and what do you think Putin will ultimately settle for, if anything? And beyond that, do you think he has ambitions beyond Ukraine?
Yeah, these are questions that people often put to me. What is Putin thinking? I mean, as for the territory, let's be perfectly clear. When Vladimir Putin announced the full-scale invasion. He said, we're not going into Ukraine to occupy territory." He said, and I do believe he was very sincere. I think he was also sincere in calling it a special military operation. He thought this was going to take really weeks, if not days, to decapitate the Zelensky government, install a puppet regime, and call it a day, right? I mean, so there was no plan to sort of occupy large swaths of territory. This was about returning to a position where a government in Kiev is dependent on Moscow primarily for energy, but also for sort of political direction. And that was the goal. That was what was supposed to happen. It was not supposed to turn into a grinding war costing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives. So I think we really need to be clear about that. This is not about Donetsk, the Donetsk regions, the Zaporizhia region. This is not why Vladimir Putin is throwing so much of his treasure at Ukraine. This is about a geopolitical domination. Now, as far as what makes me, well, you mentioned Steve Witkoff. This is important, but I think even this week, which was billed as being such a critical week, I think Donald Trump let the cat out of the bag when he said that this will not be solved uh, until I meet Vladimir Putin myself. And in other words, it doesn't matter what that Zelensky went to Turkey with the openness to sit down with Putin. It doesn't matter who showed up to talk with whom. It absolutely does not matter. Donald Trump thinks I need to sit down with Putin, and there are now indications that something may be in the works. And in fact, I would say this gives, in some ways, Donald Trump the perfect pretext now to arrange a summit with Vladimir Putin, and we're going to solve this problem. And the name we don't hear here is Volodymyr Zelensky. So again, despite the fact that Zelensky, and I'm sorry, you did ask about how Zelensky evolved as a leader. Um, he Zelensky came from a very difficult relationship with Donald Trump. He entered, well, or Donald Trump entered the White House not having very good feelings about Zelensky. We saw the way that this initial minerals deal was forced on the Ukrainians. The blow up in the White House on February 28th. This looked all very bad, and Zelensky actually did everything the Americans wanted. Now they've signed a minerals deal, which is not on paper detrimental to the Ukrainians in any way. So he did a good job there from a Ukrainian perspective. He did a good job also, sitting down and talking to Trump in the Vatican during the Pope Francis's funeral. So, there were moments where Zelensky really recovered the situation, and he was ready to meet Putin himself. And despite all these efforts, we see now Donald Trump saying, it doesn't really matter. It's only gonna, the only people that can solve it are me and Vladimir Putin. So I actually expect that, in some ways, it doesn't matter even what Steve Witkoff says. It doesn't matter what any of these, what the Secretary of State of the United States says, because in the end, it's going to have to be some kind of agreement between, Putin and Trump. This is, of course, something that Putin likes to do. He's always thought that, world problems can be solved with other leaders. The best is if there are not a lot of advisors sitting around. I mean, we've seen him do in negotiations with all sorts of leaders, one-on-one. And so I think in his mind, Vladimir Putin sees the Yalta Conference, for example, in 1945, as when Stalin met with Churchill and Roosevelt. This is the level that he wants to be on to decide world affairs. And of course, someone from Putin's perspective, someone like Zelensky is certainly not on that level. So I think that's where we're heading, to some kind of agreement like that. Does it make me very optimistic? Well, the United States might make some kind of concessions like recognizing Crimea. It will only prove to the Kremlin that they were right all along, that this aggression against an completely unprovoked aggression, that it pays off, and that you just have to have the patience, and you'll prevail in the end. And I think we need to be very careful about what kind of agreement we the world comes up with. Ukraine has to be in a position where it can defend itself against any kind of future aggression, and this will be the key point: the security guarantees. How does Ukraine secure its own security? And it doesn't seem like Donald Trump cares a whole lot about that, which is worrisome.
No, security guarantees really haven't featured at all as part of these negotiations, except for the minerals deal, which some in the administration would argue is a form of security guarantee because it gives the US a stake, right, in Ukraine's economic prosperity. But I do want to get to questions now because we have so many good ones, and we won't have time to get to them all. But I'll start with this one since we were just talking about the um, peace process. So, do you think that Russia and Putin would consider a frozen conflict in Ukraine as a relative victory over the West?
I think a frozen conflict. This is the danger, right? I mean, we might be heading to some kind of agreement that freezes a situation as such, but a frozen conflict is, only frozen. It's not a resolved conflict, and I think the danger here is that at some point it becomes unfrozen again, when either side feels that they've rebuilt up the strength, to fight another day. And this really goes for both sides, right? I mean, the Russians are always saying that the Ukrainians are going to use any pause to regroup and rebuild, but that certainly also applies to the Russian military. So I think the problem with a frozen conflict is that it's not a sustainable solution.
So this is another question. What is there a real way then to stop him? And this person writes his imperial greed. What would it really take? And would victory for Ukraine in Ukraine be enough? Is there ever going to be a point where Putin says, "Okay, enough is enough"?
Well, and as to, you also gave me so many great questions, Natasha, and I might not have gone into depth on all of them. I think we're getting to the question of really, what danger does Putin pose, or does Russia? I think, and here we can say, Russia as a country, because Putin is mortal. What danger does Russia pose now to the rest of the world, even if some resolution can be reached in Ukraine? I mean, my feeling is that after so many years spent in Russia observing the Kremlin, that certainly Ukraine plays a very special role. Yeah, well, Ukraine and Belarus play a very special role for Russia. They consider these neighbors as a core to any sort of East Slavic empire led by Russia. So, the fate of Georgia, Armenia, of the Baltic nations is not on that same level. There, it is much more, that those are our former dominions, and we need to be in charge, and they have strategic value, right? It's about the strategic value of these countries rather than some kind of emotional, historical, ethnic, religious link, which Putin makes to Ukraine. So I think it's a totally valid question. A lot of very serious people in Europe are saying that we have to prepare for future conflict. I think in the interim, obviously Russia is not in any position. I mean, let's look at it from the other side. Russia, which had the most powerful army in Europe, was unable to conquer a much smaller adversary. and so that is a disaster, and obviously Russia is not in any position to launch any new attacks against NATO. I think in the interim, what we're really looking at is the danger um, of sabotage or murky situations. Someone that we saw in eastern Ukraine in 2014, where it was unclear who is actually the actor. Is this the Russian military? Is it Russian special forces? Or is it some kind of freelancers, trying to get the Kremlin's attention? And this is, I think, where NATO will be tested because, was it an intentional drone attack? Was it an intentional violation of airspace? Did that missile was that missile aimed at us, or did it just drop on our territory? I think we're going to see a lot of testing, and especially as with Donald Trump in the White House expressing doubt whether the United States stands behind Article 5. I think this is, I think there will be a temptation to test rather than, launch any new invasions. Russia certainly is not in that position in a position to do that right now, but it can still wreak a lot of havoc.
Right, it's those hybrid attacks and the sabotage attacks that the Europeans in particular are so worried about now. Zooming out a bit, just going back to your reporting experiences, because those obviously inform the core of your book. One person asks here, given your experience on the ground, how do local perspectives in Ukraine and Russia differ from the narratives that are often portrayed in Western media?
Well, yeah. I would say you're always surprised, right? When you're reporting on the ground and talking with people outside the capitals, you're often surprised by what people say. One thing, also to go back to, Crimea and the importance of Crimea to Ukrainians and also to Russians. I had lived in Russia for many years before the seizure and annexation of Crimea. And I personally, although I knew many Russian nationalists or people leaning in that direction, I had never heard anyone say we need Crimea back. There were people on the political scene in Russia, for example, the Moscow mayor, people, nationalist firebrands like Vladimir Zalinskys, who are always talking about Crimea. But ordinary Russians, they loved Crimea. I heard people talk about Crimea, how much they loved Crimea. That was certainly something. But this idea that we need it back, in quotes, is not something I really heard because people could travel there, right? I mean, people could go there whenever they wanted. There were lots of flights from all over Russia that went to Crimea, so you didn't need a visa or even a passport to go there. So people had certainly had an affinity for it, but this idea that it should become a part of Russia was not there. Of course, what's interesting is once Putin went ahead and illegally annexed Crimea, of course, that led to a wave of patriotic euphoria, and the polls show that 85–90% of the population supported it. But again, this was not a response to a groundswell of opinion in Russia, and on the flip side, in Ukraine. I mean, I try to show in my book, although there were separatist tendencies in Crimea in the 1990s, those had really died down by the 2000s, and people were not necessarily very happy about living in independent Ukraine or in a country called Ukraine, but they were very much focused on their local lives, and I mean that's what surprises you most of the time. What I find truly tragic in Ukraine, and I point this out in my book as well. I traveled through eastern Ukraine during 2014 as this insurgency was growing. And what I find truly tragic was, I met people who sympathized with Russia. I met people who are very patriotic about being in Ukraine. All of them, I should say, Russian speakers. There were a variety of opinions on the ground, but one thing I often heard when I asked people, and this is, people in villages, farmers, I would say, well, so who do you support? Are you for Kiev or are you for these separatists? And they would say, it doesn't matter as long as there's not war. And, the fact that the war has come back to them, and I say come back because this is Eastern Ukraine is also a region that was ravaged by World War II when the Nazis went east, and then when the Red Army liberated that territory and rolled back. It's a war ravaged land, and the fact that these people who just wanted to live their little lives in peace ended up in this absolutely devastating war is truly tragic.
Could you, I mean, we only have time for one more question, but I'm gonna use my privileges here because I'm so curious what you this is something that is a big topic of discussion is language, and Russian versus Ukrainian. And today, actually, during these talks between the Russian delegation and the Ukrainians spoke to the Russians through a translator because they were refusing to speak Russian. They're speaking Ukrainian. Obviously, all of the Ukrainians, it's safe to say, they speak Russian, so they could have spoken that to them directly
Absolutely.
in Russian, but it's a political act at this point, right? But it wasn't always that way. As you lay out in your book, most people in Ukraine, they do speak Russian, and it wasn't seen as leaning towards Moscow or having a political loyalty to Moscow. So can you just talk a little bit about the language aspect, because I think it's fascinating.
Yes, I mean, it's I don't even know where to begin. I mean, when I traveled to Ukraine, started traveling to Ukraine in 2005, uh, I spoke Russian. I usually went to Kiev. I spent a lot of time in Kiev. I know Kiev very well. And that was a Russian-speaking city. And further east was also completely Russian-speaking. Cities like Kharkiv, Crimea was Russian-speaking. Of course, if you speak to Ukrainians, they say, well, there's a reason why we're Russian-speaking. It's because we were strongly Russified. And certainly in the Russian Empire, what happened was, the universities were in Russian, business was conducted in Russian. So if you wanted to get somewhere in life, also, and later in the Soviet Union, Russian was the language, also because you could get out of Ukraine, and as many Ukrainians became actors, on the national stage in the Soviet Union. So there was kind of certainly an openness, and I think people need to understand that Ukraine is in a just geographically, culturally, linguistically where it's located. It's kind of a great language gradient between Ukrainian, which is spoken in Western Ukraine, and Russia, and that there's also a hybrid language called Surzhyk, which many people speak, and often in conversation people don't even know what language they're speaking. You can tell that, and often you will hear people speaking on the street, and one person will be speaking in Russian, the other person in Ukrainian, and they might easily switch languages as well. They are, I mean, I should point out, they are both East Slavic languages, and they're sort of the same proximity as maybe Spanish and Italian. So they're very similar languages, but they are certainly distinct. And also Russians, when they go to Ukraine, usually cannot understand Ukrainian. So this issue of language was really exploited by the Kremlin. It was not really an issue for people. They just spoke whatever language they wanted to. You know, Volodymyr Zelensky is a perfect example. I mean, he built a career on in Russian for a Ukrainian audience as well. And there were certainly people that criticized him for that already back then, but most ordinary people didn't really care. And what I've certainly, even when I was there in 2014, the people still spoke Russian to me, and now it's when I go back, people are increasingly speaking very good English, I should say. And people will speak Russian. I mean, Ukrainians still speak obviously often privately to each other in Russian, but in public it's all Ukrainian. And I can hold up this book. I've also started learning Ukrainian because at this point it's a sign of disrespect if you don't at least make an effort.
Right. It became intensely political too after the invasion, obviously. Well, we are at time. So much more in this great book. And I hope everyone gets a chance to pick it up. But I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, Lucian, and very, very honored and happy that you asked me to moderate. So Thank you so much, everyone. And Lucian, do you want to say anything in conclusion?
Well, my thanks go to you, of course, Natasha, for agreeing to do this, for reading my book in advance. And as I mentioned before, also to the Atlantic Council for organizing this great event. And obviously, my thanks go to everyone who joined today. And I'm sorry we couldn't take all the questions, but hopefully there will be other opportunities in the future.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.